Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the WaterTalk. Very good to see such a nice turnout during Reading Week. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge that I participate today here from traditional territories of the traditional Neutral Anishinaabe Haudenosaunee peoples. Our campus is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land granted to the Six Nations. That includes 6 miles, as you can see here on the map, on each side of the Grand River. And our work towards reconciliation takes place across campus through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and is centralized within the Indigenous Initiatives Office. We're very happy to have Dr. Ryan Emmanuel here with us today. He's an Associate Professor of Hydrology at Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment. He's a member of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, and at Duke, Dr. Emmanuel leads a research group that studies the impacts of climate change, pollution, and unsustainable development on water, ecosystems, and society. His group partners with Indigenous communities to understand environmental change through the lenses of environmental justice and Indigenous rights. Before joining Duke in 2022, Dr. Emmanuel was a professor of hydrology at North Carolina State University and also published his book that came out last year, On the Swamp. It's called Fighting for Indigenous Environmental Justice, and his talk will be making references to that book today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ryan Emmanuel to the floor.
Thank you for inviting me to give a water talk here, and thank you for that kind introduction. This is my first time visiting Waterloo. And so I spent some time earlier this week reading about your Office of Indigenous Relations and your university's Indigenous Strategic Plan, and I was struck by this quote from your president and vice chancellor that I found in the strategic plan. As educators, we have an obligation to teach all of our students and the public the hard truths about our country's colonial history and the extensive damages done to the lives, histories, and spirits of Indigenous peoples. I agree with that statement. I think it's especially important for those of us who study interactions between people and the environment to bring these truths into our work. Sometimes the interactions and the challenges and the injustices that we observe and analyze in our work only make sense if we can grasp the long histories of colonialism that influence the places that many of us study and the people who live and have attachments to those places. So I am a Lumbee person, and my homeland is one of these places marked by colonialism. It's beautiful, but it's been transformed by centuries of exploitation, pollution, unsustainable development, and now climate change. This is a photo of the Lumbee River. It's a blackwater stream that cuts through our ancestral and present-day home on the coastal plain of what is now North Carolina. I don't know, is that too dark? Or, can you all see? Okay. So my book, On the Swamp, features several stories about how Lumbee people and our indigenous neighbors on the coastal plain experience and deal with these radical changes to our homelands. My goal for this talk is to tell you why I wrote the book, and also to share about some of the science and the humanity that accompany these changes. But before we go there, I wanted to point out that it does indeed take truth-telling about colonialism to put all of these phenomena into a broader context. And for that reason, I actually start the book with a call for readers to consider this broader context by outlining the long history of colonialism in our region, a reimagined land acknowledgement for our homelands, if you will. So in the first chapter of the book, I critique performative land acknowledgements that have cropped up throughout the United States in the past decade or so. I don't know if that is the experience here in Canada. But I also ask readers to reimagine a land acknowledgement as a story that takes a while to tell. So I want to start by reading a brief excerpt for you from that chapter. More than 50 years ago, Lakota scholar Vine Deloria Jr. lamented the proliferation of what he called, quote, easy knowledge about Indians. In his groundbreaking book, Custer Died for Your Sins, Deloria explained that settlers have always been quick to explain who Native Americans are, where we came from, and even unnervingly, what it's like to be us. Deloria's words ring true today when it comes to the accessibility of resources for crafting land acknowledgements. Maps and more are at our fingertips. Unfortunately, this easy knowledge does little to promote reciprocity, accountability, or redress for the expropriation of Indigenous territory. Instead, it reinforces the idea that land acknowledgements are simply fill-in-the-blank exercises in which the only tricky part is correctly pronouncing the name of a tribe that one has discovered through a web-based tool. I hope that readers will see in a new light some of the perfunctory phrases embedded in popular but performative land acknowledgements. One that I hear regularly is, "These are the ancestral lands of." And that phrase carries both truth and trauma that can slip past uneducated ears. Indigenous homelands on the coastal plain are places of deep connection and remembrance, but they're also places where traumatic colonial experiences befell our ancestors. That trauma still flows through our communities today. The pain of racial oppression and cultural loss combines with the transformation of our homelands, and it haunts us from generation to generation. I know the look and feel of these traumatic experiences. I belong to a people who are still afflicted by legacies of oppression. We cannot talk about our connections to place unless we grapple with the long-term impacts of settler colonialism on the coastal plain, a 25,000 square mile swath of present-day North Carolina that stretches from the base of the Piedmont to the barrier islands that jut out into the Atlantic Ocean. The connections that Lumbee people and our Indigenous neighbors hold to our ancestral landscapes and waterways on the coastal plain are strong, but they are also colored by this trauma. My interest is not to give an oversized platform to violence and oppression, but rather to set the stage for other stories that explain present-day environmental issues faced by Lumbee people and our neighbors. It is not possible to understand these issues without a basic grasp of what Lumbee people have experienced in the long centuries since settlers first arrived. This chapter is not the easy knowledge that Deloria criticized, but it's also not a thorough retelling of our histories. Instead, consider it a partial antidote to the trend of cheap and easy land acknowledgements that reduce Indigenous people's long and complex relationships to place to a brief recitation. If it helps, consider this chapter a reimagined land acknowledgement for Eastern North Carolina, or maybe simply take a seat and listen. And I want to start by saying that I wrote this book in part to model for students, professionals, and even the general public how to use frameworks like environmental justice and Indigenous rights, which I'll talk about in a little more detail later, to understand and address the deep connections between present-day environmental issues like climate change and the histories of settler colonialism that prop up many of the disparities that are laid bare by these issues. I also wrote this book for my people. I wanted to share some of the stories of survival and resilience and adaptation in the midst of all this radical environmental change. To be clear, I'm writing about my people, the Lumbee, but I'm also writing about our Indigenous neighbors and our kin in what's now Eastern North Carolina. My ultimate goal was to do right by both of these audiences. The future's writing on the extent to which the public can understand environmental justice and Indigenous rights clearly and not just as buzzwords. And the practice of telling our stories is important for ensuring that Indigenous peoples are included in decisions about the future that's really going to affect all of us. And so the backstory is that I didn't set out to write a book. I'm trained as a hydrologist. I went into that field because I was drawn to the outdoors, rivers, forests, mountains, but I also like math, physics, and computer modeling. So it turns out that hydrology is a way to merge all of those things together. All my academic training focused on Western scientific frameworks for understanding rivers and their surrounding watersheds as complex integrated systems. For the first several years of my career, I focused almost exclusively on environmental fieldwork, modeling, and data analysis in the northern Rocky Mountains, the southern Appalachian Mountains, and coastal North Carolina. On the left-hand side, this is one of my graduate students from North Carolina State University back in his home country of Honduras. He's installing a water monitoring station to understand the impacts of agroforestry on water quality in Central America. And on the right, that's me as an early career professor at Appalachian State, which is a predominantly undergraduate institution in North Carolina up in the mountains, building a tower for an atmospheric monitoring station to study air quality around campus. As you can see, I was trained to measure, monitor, and quantify the environment using sensors and computers and all the technologies that you all are familiar with. Early in my career, I moved from Appalachian State to North Carolina State, which is a very large research extensive university, and there I continued to build research and teaching programs that focus on interactions between plants, soils, and water and all kinds of environments. And indeed, that work has continued in the few years that I've been at Duke. But importantly, moving down out of the mountains into central North Carolina allowed me to be much closer to home. Lumbee homelands are less than 2 hours away from where I now live, and I really feel privileged to live that close to home. From an early age, my Lumbee family taught me that the purpose of an education is to serve your people. And when you aim to serve your people, proximity matters. One problem with serving your people is that you don't always get a lot of career-specific advice. The Lumbee community produces a lot of physicians and attorneys and teachers, but not many environmental scientists. In fact, I did not meet another Lumbee or even Indigenous environmental scientist until I was a professor myself. So think about this. The first time I was in the classroom with an Indigenous professor was on my first day of teaching. I was the professor. So I had many mentors and role models, but in the absence of a Lumbee-specific roadmap, it took a long time to figure out what it meant to serve my people as a professor and as a scientist. So as a fresh assistant professor, I became an ambassador for higher education and for STEM. I went to college recruiting events and hosted visiting students on campus and led science field days back home for Lumbee students. It was great, but it was somewhat disconnected from my research interests as a scholar. And all of that changed about a decade ago when the North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs invited me to advise their newly formed Environmental Justice Committee. That committee was made up of Indigenous leaders and decision makers from across the state, all of whom had interest in protecting the communities and the landscapes that their ancestors had called home since time immemorial. And that was a leap of faith for me to join that committee because I had no background whatsoever in environmental justice or environmental policy. But it occurred to me that the time was ripe and that this work needed to be done. So I want to pause for a moment and tell you all a little more about the Indigenous peoples of North Carolina. This map shows the wetlands of our region in green, along with the names of some of the present-day tribal nations in North Carolina. Many of these present-day nations comprise survivors of historic peoples whose societies were broken up by colonialism during the 1600s and 1700s. We are complex and diverse peoples today, culturally and politically. One recurring theme throughout the book is how political statuses can either help or hinder our efforts to protect our homelands and our home waters. Lumbee people in particular have a singularly unique political status in the United States. I won't go into too much detail, but I'll say that we're governed by a 1950s federal law that acknowledges us as an American Indian tribe, but forbids a formal relationship between our tribe and the US government. There are more details about the political situation in the 2020 article here from which this figure is taken. It's an article that I co-wrote with Lumbee political scientist David Wilkins. I also want to point out that there are other Indigenous peoples who have ties to this particular geography, including Tuscarora people who belong to the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee. Their ancestral homelands include a large swath of what's now eastern North Carolina. Importantly, Indigenous peoples of the coastal plain, the area that has so much green shading, share connections to wetlands and rivers and coastal waters that are really abundant throughout this region. And so I'll give you a very quick tour. We have these amazing bald cypress trees, taxodium, found all over our homelands. Here are some along a lake shore near the coast. These are some ancient bald cypress trees along the Black River in an old growth swamp that's one of the only places spared from logging at the turn of the 20th century. As a result, these particular trees, including the one on the right, are more than 2,500 years old, which I believe make them among the oldest trees in eastern North America. These are some beautiful bald cypress trees back again along the Lumbee River. You can see the main channel of the river in the background and the distinct cypress knees that jut up out of the floodplain soils. And the Lumbee River's floodplain is just spectacular. The river meanders through a wide belt of green bald cypress trees. Here you can see the dark tea-colored water, which gets its color from dissolved organic matter that's picked up from organic soils that are spread throughout the headwaters and all along the riparian corridors. This is another aerial view of the Lumbee River, this time in winter. So bald cypress, some of you may know this, is a deciduous conifer. Every fall, its needles fall off. They turn a dark reddish-brown color. You're seeing the naked gray trunks here in January. In addition to organic soils, the watershed's full of white quartz sand. The headwaters of the Lumbee River sit in ancient coastal sand dunes. And the point bar that you see on this image is white sand underneath that dark tea-colored water. And just for context, this stretch of river is only located 60 kilometers or so from the Atlantic Ocean. So now that you've seen our geographic situation, I want to say that as I worked alongside present-day tribal leaders, I began to see commonalities in our cultural attachments to water and how they connect us to our ancestors. I saw these things while paddling blackwater streams with members of the Coharie tribe, our neighbors to the northeast, visiting culturally important springs with other communities, and spending time on the Lumbee River, my own ancestral river. As I listened carefully to understand all of the ways that Indigenous peoples think about their relationships to water, I began to see these commonalities more specifically. So this is Philip Bell from the Coharie tribe, who I write about in the book on our first paddling trip together when he was envisioning what it would look like to restore the river in a culturally important way, in a culturally appropriate way. And I also caught glimpses during this time of threats to our waters, threats from fossil fuels, including the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which was a shale gas project that would have fed several brand new gas-fired power plants in North Carolina and Virginia. From 2017 to 2020, I worked alongside the Commission of Indian Affairs and with individual tribal governments to understand the pipeline's impacts to our communities. And during this time, I started to write about environmental justice for the first time, which at its core is about the equitable treatment and meaningful involvement of all people in environmental decision-making. For Indigenous peoples in particular, meaningful involvement means appropriate engagement during the decision-making process, and appropriate acknowledgement of the unique cultural harms that these types of projects can cause. In 2017, I published a brief commentary in Science explaining how everybody benefits from meaningful Indigenous engagement, and everybody similarly suffers when that engagement doesn't happen. I coupled the commentary with a simple analysis that showed how federal regulators had completely overlooked very large Indigenous populations when they were carrying out their mandatory environmental justice analysis, which in the US consists primarily of a demographic study to determine whether low wealth or racially marginalized populations face disproportionate harm from a particular project or even a policy implementation. On this map, you can see several North Carolina tribes whose homelands would have been disrupted by the construction and operation of this project. And the inset map shows the pipeline's terminus located right in the heart of a historic Lumbee community called Prospect. Overall, some 30,000 Indigenous people lived along this pipeline route in North Carolina alone. And so they made up 13% of the entire population that would have been affected by this project. For context, at the time, North Carolina had a total Indigenous population of 120,000 people, and we made up just over 1% of the state's population. So that's about as clear an example of a demographic disproportionality as I can give you. In fact, it's now literally a textbook example, as those calculations are cited in at least 2 different textbooks that are used to teach environmental justice in the US. At the end of the science commentary, I pointed out that pipeline proponents get to incur setbacks and delays when they don't take environmental justice and Indigenous engagement seriously. And almost exactly 3 years after I published that piece, the proponents canceled the entire project after legal challenges had delayed the project by multiple years and had raised the estimated construction cost from initial estimate of $4.5 billion US dollars to nearly $8 billion US dollars. I learned so many lessons through my years of research and advocacy work on the Atlantic Coast Pipeline Project, and it forms the most detailed case study and the longest chapter in the book. Outside of my book, I've continued to study the disproportionate impacts of US natural gas pipelines on marginalized and vulnerable populations. This is a figure from a 2021 study that I led, showing that across the US, pipelines are packed more densely in areas where social vulnerability is high. Social vulnerability is a composite index that represents a community's ability to recover from adverse events. These could be health, economic, natural disasters, and so forth. On the map, the yellow areas are more vulnerable, meaning that they have less ability to recover from these adverse events. And these areas tend to have more gas pipelines. You can see the correlation coefficients at right, which are taken from this scatter plot, which shows that the correlation is most pronounced at extreme pipeline densities. In other words, low vulnerability communities, if you ask them what is an extremely dense network of pipeline, they would say, oh, probably 20 to 25 kilometers of pipeline per 100 square kilometers of land area. Whereas a high vulnerability community would say high density is more like 50 to 60 kilometers of pipeline per 100 square kilometers of land area. And so over the years, I also caught glimpses of threats to our homelands from other issues besides fossil fuels. This is a massive bank of 48 industrial poultry sheds that were under construction back in 2019. Concentrated animal feeding operations, to use the acronym CAFOs in Canada. In the US, they're commonly called CAFOs. For context, each one of these buildings is 200 meters long. Unlike swine operations, these poultry facilities require no water quality permits whatsoever in North Carolina, and there's little public information about them, yet they are major sources of nutrient and bacteria pollution to nearby waterways. These livestock facilities have been major focuses of research in North Carolina and other states for decades. And several years ago, we looked at how these facilities are represented in land cover data sets, given that those individual sheds are so large that they can easily take up multiple pixels in a remotely sensed data set or a land cover data set. Notably, we found that 14% of the swine facilities in North Carolina were classified as wetlands in the National Land Cover data set. That's important for modelers to consider because these facilities can have the opposite ecological functions that we think about wetlands having. Namely, they can exacerbate pollution instead of mediating it. In addition to CAFOs, I also witnessed firsthand threats from climate change when Hurricanes Matthew and Florence inundated eastern North Carolina several years ago. This is a graduate student who works with me, Jocelyn Painter. She's actually been with me ever since North Carolina State University. The two of us are here collecting water samples from the Great Coharie River a few days after Hurricane Florence in 2018. The samples that we collected that day were part of a larger rapid response project that eventually identified a poultry gut bacteria in 3/4 of the water samples that we collected, along with many other pathogens that are associated with either human waste or livestock waste in these floodwaters. We were in the field that day with two elders from the Coharie tribe, Philip Bell in the kayaking photo that I shared earlier, and also Greg Jacobs, the tribal administrator. It was a rough time in terms of the stench of animal waste in the floodwaters that just permeated the entire area. I want to pause now and read a second excerpt from the book, which takes place on the exact same day that this photo was taken. At one point that day, I left the other team members behind at a van parked along the highway, and I walked a short distance down the shoulder of the road to collect a water sample from a flooded ditch. Before I had a chance to collect the sample, I encountered a man who told me that he believed water sampling threatened his livelihood. Lucky for me, he explained, my shirt, a bright red polo with my university's logo, was the only reason he had not shot his gun at me. The man, who was involved in various aspects of both swine and poultry operations, depended on the industries to make a living in a place where his family had lived for generations. He believed that water sampling had been weaponized against him and his neighbors in a way that could ultimately jeopardize their way of life. I sympathized with the man. The encounter took place in a part of Sampson County, North Carolina, where my ancestors had lived and farmed from before European contact until the middle of the 19th century. The roadside ditch, the road, and possibly even the neighbor's house where the man lived had all been part of my ancestors' territory. I didn't say any of this out loud. I only listened while he lectured me for 15 minutes or so about the politics of environmental monitoring, the price of fertilizer, and more. We parted ways, and I trudged back to the van, deflated. I did not feel that the two of us had connected in any meaningful way. I opened the driver's side door and hoisted myself inside. From their vantage point in the van, my companions could see that a serious conversation had taken place, but they were too far away to make out any details. I could tell by their silence that they knew the conversation had not gone well for me. I was actually thankful for the quiet interior. It was a welcome respite after the man's threat and stern lecture. I am not sure where it first began, but a few seconds after I closed the van door, giggles erupted from somewhere behind the driver's seat. In moments, the van burst into raucous laughter. The four of us sat on the side of the highway and laughed without speaking for several minutes. We were not laughing at the man. There was nothing funny about the conversation, and I had not yet told anyone about it. We were simply four Native people laughing together at a stressful day, the post-flood situation, or maybe life in general. So after that, I go on to quote, once again, Vine Deloria Jr., who observed, when a people can laugh at themselves and laugh at others and hold all aspects of life together without letting anyone drive them to extremes, then it seems to me that a people can survive. And so that was a small moment of joy in a day that was otherwise pretty grim. This day actually made real for me the connection between all of these threats that I've shared with you so far. Fossil fuel consumption drives climate change that brings floods that spread animal waste across the landscape. But that day also made me cherish the more peaceful times on the river even more than I had before. This is a section of the Lumbee River that's a popular refuge for people during the summer. Folks picnic and swim and fish here, just as they have for generations. And it was really this love of the river as a place that finally drove me to pull all of these disparate stories together into a book. But I also had to provide context for readers who don't know that long and traumatic history of colonialism in eastern North Carolina. Another Haudenosaunee connection for you all. This is a monument to one of the most violent conflicts in the colonial South. Just outside of Greenville, North Carolina, a militia led by settlers from South Carolina laid siege to a massive indigenous fort along Contentnia Creek, which is a large water body in eastern North Carolina. And on this very site, 900 Tuscarora people and their allies were burned to death or captured and sold into slavery, most of them being shipped into the Caribbean, never to return home again. I wanted people to understand how that particular event and others like it fractured our societies and set the stage for the centuries of discrimination and marginalization that has lasted up until the present. Along the way, I also explained the idea of ecological refugia, how species survive in favorable microclimates following climate change. And I linked this idea to the ways that wetland landscapes serve as refugia for indigenous peoples of the coastal plain during colonization. In the book, I summarize a prior analysis of nearly 100 historic maps of North Carolina that comes from a study that I published in 2019. And it shows that settlers could not accurately map Lumbee homelands until around the year 1800, which is shocking given that permanent settler occupation began in the late 1600s. And this area is less than 100 kilometers from the Atlantic Ocean. It just illustrates that this area was largely inaccessible to outsiders up until a fairly late date. I also wanted people to know about indigenous resistance to colonialism, including a decade-long guerrilla war led by Lumbee hero Henry Berry Lowry. Lowry was one of many Lumbee men who fled into the swamps along the Lumbee River to avoid conscription into hard labor during the U.S. Civil War. During that war, Lumbees were actually drafted to build Confederate fortifications along the Atlantic coast. Lowry led a band of freedom fighters who launched raids against local white supremacists, militias, and even federal troops. He was demonized by many of the local elites, but he was considered a champion by Indigenous and Black people in the area. Lowry disappeared without a trace in 1872 at the height of this guerrilla conflict. And because his burial place and really his fate are unknown, Lumbees often view the river as a memorial to him. I also wanted people to understand what contemporary cultural and historical preservation look like for Lumbee people. I share a story about the burning and restoration of Old Main, which is a historic building on the campus of the University of North Carolina at Pembroke, an institution that was founded by Lumbee ancestors during the 19th century as a teacher training school. So during that time, white supremacists in North Carolina had institutionalized a tri-racial apartheid, creating separate facilities and schools for whites, African Americans, and indigenous people. This training institute allowed us to staff our schools with indigenous teachers and principals who came from our own communities. And as a result, these schools were very different from the residential schools that have caused so much harm to indigenous peoples here in Canada. And to be clear, our schools still focused on Western education, but at the same time, they helped to maintain indigenous communities and cultures throughout Eastern North Carolina at a time when there was very harsh racial oppression against non-whites in the region. And I want to note that this is not very long ago. Both of my parents attended these segregated Indian schools for their entire grade school education. And I'm part of the first generation of Lumbees to attend racially integrated schools. The book explores cultural connections and ideas around collective ownership by looking at how Lumbee people came together to save this historic building from demolition, to lobby for renovation after it burned in 1973, and you can see the aftermath of that in this photograph, and also to turn it into the home of one of the very first American Indian Studies programs in the southern US. This story, focuses on the built environment, but it also highlights important themes about how Lumbee people view collective ownership and belonging. And one of my favorite quotes from a Lumbee person of all times is in this chapter. So Ruth Revels was a Lumbee educator, and she wrote an impassioned letter to the local newspaper editor around the time that this building was threatened with demolition. And she said, "There is more than one way to own a thing. Some of the most precious things that we all own were not bought and paid for with money." And so what she was saying was that the state of North Carolina may hold the deed to this building and may ultimately decide the fate. But apart from that, the building and the institution itself really belongs to Lumbee people because It was through their work, their labor, and their organizing that actually created the institution in the first place. And to this day, many Lumbee people still view this fully public institution as theirs. And it was an amazing experience last summer when I had the honor to do a book reading in front of the now restored Old Main, which today houses the Department of American Indian Studies and also the Museum of the Southeast American Indian. And then finally, I use this book to encourage people to think about how they can reconnect with culturally important waters. Because when any of us, Indigenous or non-Indigenous, take time to form attachments to particular places, I think we can start to see these places more like relatives to take care of instead of resources to exploit. And that shift in perspective is an essential part of unwinding those tendrils of colonialism that affect the way we move through the world and the way that we think about our work as scientists, professionals, and students. And I think this is true whether we realize it or not. This is a tall order, but I really did write the book, and much of my work today is dedicated to this idea of equipping the next generation with a different mindset for thinking through the environmental issues that we confront in our research and in our studies. Or at the very least, knowing that the mindset that most of us learn in a university setting is just one of many that we can bring to our work. And this is a core idea in environmental justice. We called it recognition justice, the acknowledgement that there are multiple and sometimes competing sets of values that we can bring to bear on the decisions that we make. And to me, coming to this realization and helping our students and trainees realize this plurality of perspectives and values is really the baseline step that we need to accomplish before we can start to have truly change-making conversations about relationships between people and the environment. And so even though I'm a hydrologist and I continue to train students in hydrology, I think it's incredibly important to give our students this broader context for the places and the communities that we all study and care about. And so with that, I want to thank you all very much. And I'd love to spend the rest of our time hearing from you. What questions do you have, or what do you want to talk about? Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Ryan. We have 10-15 minutes for questions. Anyone? Maybe think about.
I really enjoyed that, Ryan. My name is Rob DeLoe. And so, where am I going with this? I had so many good questions. I have to say, so it sounds like you described the arc of your career, and there was something nudged you off in a different direction. And I just want to say I'm really glad that happened, because I have a feeling what you're doing here is really interesting and important work. So I'm glad whatever that was, that nudge that sent you, that it happened. So you partly answered my opening question, which is, are you still a hydrologist? And the answer seems to be yes. And so I guess what I want to know is, you're also a storyteller, and a really good one, and you've mobilized your storytelling power for your work with environmental justice and education. Are you also, is that bleeding into your hydrology as well? So in other words, are they separate domains? It's like, okay, now I'm putting on my hydrology hat and I'm doing Western science and there's no storytelling, or have they bled together somehow and are now inseparable?
That's a great question. It's not an easy one to answer, and it's related to a conversation that Kevin and I had this morning. At times it feels like these are two parallel streams, and it's not 50% hydrology and 50% environmental justice. It's 100% and 100%, which is not really a sustainable professional model to follow. And so I do look for opportunities for crossover and integration. Most of those that have occurred thus far have occurred informally through the way that I mentor my students and trainees to talk about the research that they do. I have 2 graduate students who are working on these pipeline geospatial studies, and we spend a lot of time talking about the importance of the narrative that accompanies the quantitative analysis. And while I fully expect them to have rigorous geospatial and statistical analyses, those analyses and the results have to be put in a context that people outside of our immediate fields can understand. And so the real light bulb moment for me was when I realized that in my case, the best person to articulate the results that I was coming up with was me. And so like we do have professional science communicators, and they do an amazing job of telling stories about the research that we do. And I certainly rely on the communication staff at Duke for a lot of the public engagement of my research, but I also have a very hands-on role in telling stories about the work that I do, and I try to instill that into my trainees as well. And that's why I say it's primarily informal, because whether these students are coming out of my group as hydrologists or geospatial analysts or what have you, I want them to be proficient in telling stories about the research that they do while still holding them to the highest levels of scientific rigor. I think when I write and publish about my work as a hydrologist, this mostly comes into play in how I think about things like introductions and discussions of papers. For years I struggled to figure out how do you start a paper and how do you finish a paper? And I think in recent years, the process of researching and writing this book has taught me the proper use of those sections. Whereas all of the teachers and professors who taught me those proper uses years ago, that was somehow lost on me. But I've managed to reacquire that in recent years. Thank you.
Just give me a second. You're far away.
Thank you so much. Really touching to hear your experiences in the field as well. I have a question about your geospatial analysis of pipelines and vulnerability. How did you quantify vulnerability? Not that I always love the quantification of that. I understand it's like super nuanced and you can do that in various different ways. Just curious how you did that.
We use an existing index called the Social Vulnerability Index, which was created by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, really as a public health tool. My understanding, the initial intent of this tool was to look at things like vulnerability to disease outbreaks or vulnerability to access to healthcare and things such as this. But if you look at the dimensions that go into this index, it includes a lot of variables that we might use to define marginalization. Socioeconomic information, information about race and ethnicity, information about access to education or access to other public services. So we use that because it was an off-the-shelf product that exists for many different scales of geographic units in the US. I'm not as clear about global indices for social vulnerability, but I imagine that this US Social Vulnerability Index could at least serve as a starting point for creating indices in other places. Mm-hmm.
So you talked about restoring rivers in a culturally appropriate way. That triggered me a little bit. Can you explain a little bit more what that means?
This is fascinating. I'll share with you this example from the Coharie tribe. And I want to say that I spent a lot of time with folks from the Coharie tribe because one side of my family was Coharie. More than a century ago, we moved and married into the Lumbee tribe. But my last name, Emmanuel, is actually a Coharie name. And so 10 years ago, the Great Coharie River became incorporated into a wetland conservation program that the state of North Carolina used to offset wetland impacts due to highway construction. And when that happened, this beautiful floodplain was put into a conservation status that really prohibited interactions with people, except for a select number of folks who could lease the land for hunting through a competitive bidding process. And so Coharie people who grew up along this river and had access to it since time immemorial were locked out of their homeland. And this is very similar to the idea of fortress conservation that we often hear about related to carbon and parks and things like this. And so Coharie people said a healthy river to us is a river that has continual hands-on interaction from people. And what that meant for them specifically was they wanted to clear out snags and storm debris from the river that had clogged up the main channel for more than a decade and had prevented them from accessing the river because water levels tended to stay higher, meaning that the floodplain was flooded longer. And there may be ecological benefits associated with greater duration of floodplain inundation, but because of the geomorphology, it prevents people from accessing the river. It also prohibited them from paddling on the river. That river historically was a major transportation corridor, source of fish, and just an amazing resource for them. And so they began to go into the river at first without permission and use hand tools to just saw out these snags and log jams and things like this. And they actually got in trouble with state regulators because they were doing this on this state conservation land. And it took years for the state of North Carolina to come around to this vision that Coharie people had, that a healthy river is one that we can walk to, that we can paddle down, and one that we can share with the rest of the world. In the years since they have been granted formal permission from the state to clear out these log jams, they themselves, or through their contractors, have cleared out more than 100 miles of rivers in Sampson County and opened them up to canoe and kayak tourism. And they are now the darlings of the conservation community in North Carolina and have won all of these conservation awards for their efforts to reconnect people with these waterways that for 10 or 20 years have been seen as waste places, just off limits to everyone except for this hunting club. And so that's what culturally important ecological restoration looks like to Coharie people. It's very different from the hands-off, let Mother Nature take over approach.
Thank you. Anyone else? More questions? No need to.
That was so beautiful, Ryan. I know, Ryan, you from the days that when you were more a traditional hydrologist, and it's been amazing seeing this journey. And part of it is like, I know Indigenous scholars that come from a social science background, but not that many that come from a natural science, quantitative natural science background. And I think that's really, really powerful to be able to actually show those numbers, find those metrics. And two kind of related questions. One was in this path of this journey, and this is similar to what was asked before. In this path, did you know going in that you would come into this space coming from a traditional, or was it more shifting as you moved along? So that was one question. The second question was, I honestly was really, really deeply moved by your story when you were out sampling. That part of that laughter gave me goosebumps, because that's how that's how we work with the toughest of situations. What struck me also in the story was you said 4 Native people in the car started laughing. And my question in there was, as you pointed out, there was the only one person in when you were being a professor. So do you find that your being there creates a space where there are others who feel comfortable entering it and being in that space?
Thank you so much for those questions. So to the first one, when I started looking at environmental justice through the lens of decision makers that I work with on the Commission of Indian Affairs, I immediately recognized that many of the quantitative tools, methods that we use in the hydrologic sciences and in environmental sciences more generally can be easily adapted to answer the same types of questions. And once I figured out that translation, which frankly included a lot of conversations with social scientists. I have been fortunate to be based now and previously in interdisciplinary departments. And I would not have felt comfortable doing this without those consultations with social scientists to make sure that the way I was envisioning those problems was actually consistent with their view of these systems. And so things like Monte Carlo simulations, which we also often use for hydrologic model parameterization, those have become incredibly useful for studying these demographic situations and for determining whether the demographic tests that environmental regulators use to quantify environmental justice, as if you could quantify it, actually they're quantifying demographic disparities. We can use Monte Carlo simulation to examine the sensitivity of those tests to figure out why they always come back negative. So regulators, when they apply these demographic tests, they never find demographic disparities. And when we put these tests through the paces, we found that the reason is they're not sensitive enough to identify disparities that are actually quite meaningful. And so that's one example of what this translation looks like. To your second question, I'm extremely encouraged, and I write about this in the last chapter of the book, about the entry of more indigenous people into the environmental sciences and the water science in particular. It felt very lonely in the beginning. It's not that no one was there, it's just we hadn't found each other yet. There are a number of amazing indigenous natural scientists who are working hydrology and related fields, but without a critical mass, you rely on Brownian motion to encounter one another, right? And so we did find each other. We formed a nucleus, and we have a small network now. And so now we're seeing our students coming up through through graduate school and through some are in the faculty ranks, and that's really encouraging. And so I think that this coming generation is going to have an easier time than we did. Yeah.
Thank you. One last question.
Thank you so much for sharing. I really got caught by you focusing on sharing time and space for your students to connect with the land and build that relationship and hence caring. I entirely agree, and that connection is lost often, so that's great you allow space for that. Now, we talked a lot about space, but time, I want to go back a little bit further. Being a geologist, I look at the swamp and the barrier islands, and I'm like, millennia and people occupying the land, and that was not a swamp at one time and then developed. So there's a deep and rich history in time and occupation during that deep time. Do you have any idea of how far that goes back in time of this swamp, and or was the coastline in there at a certain time?
Yeah, so the coastal plain was last inundated, I think, 3 million years ago, and that's why the headwaters are so full of that white beach sand. human habitation in Lumbee territory goes back 14,000 years. That's what the archaeology says. I'm not sure about the swamps, but we have many non-riparian wetlands. They're basically just ovals of wetlands that sit on the landscape, and those are old lakes. And so they filled in with sediment and with peat over the millennia. Some of the archaeological sites that date back to this 10,000 plus year old are along what were the old lake shores. And so there is this long history of people interacting with water in this region that's evident through these lakeshore settlements. And it's also evident through dugout canoes that not regularly, but occasionally are discovered in the beds of these rivers, typically after large floods scour out the riverbed. Some of them have been dated to 1,200 years old. I mean, I'm sure that they extend further back than that, but those anaerobic environments can only preserve the wood for so long. And so really, for me, it's the dugout canoes that are most fascinating, because that is the most tangible connection that we have to our ancestors' relationship to those particular waters. Because those dugout canoes situate our ancestors on a specific river or swamp at a certain point in history. Unfortunately, many of the traditional methods of dugout canoe building have been lost in the past 300 years or so, but we're starting to look to other communities that manage to retain their dugout canoe building traditions. And there are a couple of examples of folks in the past few years who have built dugout canoes, and they're using them as teaching objects and cultural objects. And so personally, that's what I am most excited about, and I want to figure out how to incorporate that into my next big research project.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Let's give Ryan another round of applause, please.
Thank you.